I'll tell you straight, I didn't stop a war with a rifle or a speech. I stopped it with bread. The last heel from a loaf no bigger than my fist and twice as hard. I tore it in half, put the bigger piece in a boy's shaking hands, and everything that had been snarling in this valley for half a century took one long breath. Wind scrapes at a man different on the high tableland. It carries grit from 3 counties and talk from a dozen graves. That afternoon, the wind sounded like the ledger of old wrongs being flipped by an impatient clerk. My sorrel mare, Lark, tossed her head, and I told her easy while we rode the fence line that veers toward Dry Willow Draw. The sky was a blue pan cooling after the day's cookfire, and to the west the basalt bluffs looked like knuckles punching up through the earth. Out there is where tales begin, and most go sour. The ranch hands were 2 ridges away, doctoring a lame heifer. I'd volunteered for the long circle because a solitary ride smooths the mind if you let it. Since I came back from the border years earlier, I'd learned to appreciate the kind of quiet that has no expectations. Folks called me Elias Hart, a name that didn't fit too tight or too loose. Hart and Hollow Creek brand, a crooked H burned onto beeves that didn't know they were arguments in an old quarrel. I'd seen what quarrels cost when men dress them up as causes. At the break of the draw, where the cottonwoods hold on by stubbornness and prayer, I saw buzzards drawing circles on the air. That alone will pull a horseman's eyes. Something was down there, beef, mule, or luckless traveler, and it was for me to find out. I palmed the carbine from the scabbard without thinking. Habit is the trade between caution and regret. What I found wasn't dead, though it was close. A boy, bones and ash. He sat under a lace of branches, legs tucked like a folded colt, eyes too big for his face. He had on a thin buckskin shirt, torn at the shoulder, and around his neck a scrap of blue calico tied the way you knot a memory to keep it from leaving. His lips were cracked open, not from words but thirst. On the ground beside him lay a fallen quail, still warm. He'd tried for it with a stone. Hit feather, not meat. I slid down, kept my palms where he could see them, and set the carbine against a root. "Afternoon," I said. "Wind's got more manners than I do, coming in without knocking." He stared, but there was no fear in it. Only that faraway look hunger teaches you when it empties the world of everything but what you don't have. I unstoppered my canteen and put it near his hand. He didn't snatch. He looked to my face first, asking what permission sounds like with no language. "Drink," I said. "Slow." He did. 3 careful swallows that you could have counted and written in a ledger. His hands trembled. I knelt and fished in my saddlebag, and there it was, bread, not fresh. Yesterday's sourdough wrapped in a checkered cloth that had been patched once on my shirt. It had ridges where my fingers had pressed it into shape. I'd been saving that heel for the long stretch back to the house. Now it was a bridge I didn't know I was going to walk across. "Take," I said. "If I tried to chew that with teeth like mine, we'd be here till snow." He reached, then stopped. His eyes fell to the brand on my saddle, our crooked H, and something passed in his face like a shadow outlawing the sun. If he knew that mark, it wasn't from friendly visits. This country had been 2 camps long before I set foot in it. On one side, the ranchers and their wire. On the other, the people of the canyon, the people, as they called themselves when they weren't translating for us. Their trails older than our fences, their waters older than our claims. 50 years we'd been trading sorrows. A steer gone missing, a horse lifted, a cousin shot, a cousin avenged, until no one could point to the first wrong without stepping on somebody's dead. "I'm not the brand," I said. "I'm just a man with bread." He lifted the heel like a hawk lifts a vole and tucked into it with a care that would have broken your heart if it hadn't already learned that motion. He didn't groan or thank or sigh. He ate until crumbs dusted his shirt like a small winter. "Got more?" I said, lying. I broke off what was left for him and palmed the smaller shaving for myself, then thought better and handed him that too. "I'm called Elias. He swallowed, then said something like Toby, the consonants soft, the breath between them like grass moving. He pointed to his chest, then out toward the bluffs. Home, he added in English. One hard word, polished enough to pass. Home's a good word, I said. Hard to keep, harder to lose. He pointed to the canteen. Mother, he whispered, tapping his lips, then lifting 2 fingers to the sky and bringing them down. Rain. He made a shape with his hands like a corral breaking. I understood enough. No rain, fences in the wrong places, and a mother who needed water more than he did. Climb up, I said, patting the saddle blanket behind mine. We'll ride to my place. I'll fill you a sack, flour, beans, salt, and we'll take you as far as I can without starting another argument with the dead. He hesitated. His eyes tracked across my face as if my intentions were written there, and he was learning his letters. He made a sign with his palm open and his fingers moving like a river, then set his hand over his heart. Gratitude doesn't need grammar. He climbed light, a quail fall up behind me, and I felt the ridges of his ribs through my coat. Lark started off without fuss. Horses know when to be quiet. We kept to the low swales, staying shy of the ridge where a rider cuts himself out on the sky and looks like a dare. As we rode, he pointed once to a grey wing of smoke far east, cooking fire, and once to a patch of rabbit brush where a snare had twisted. The land was a ledger to him, and he was reading entries I couldn't. By the time we hit the wash below the home pasture, I decided 2 things. 1, I would send him home with more than food, with a message that wasn't made of the kind of words men hurl across tables. 2, to send any message at all, I'd have to risk the sort of talk you normally save for funerals or weddings. At the yard, my windmill bucked at the breeze, and the stock tank glinted like a new coin. The house wasn't much of a house by city notions. 2 rooms, covered porch, woodpiles stacked like stubbornness, and a kitchen that had cured more grief than whiskey. I slid down, helped him to the ground, and patted Lark's shoulder. He put his hand on the mare's neck the way you bless a thing that owns you for a heartbeat. Inside, I set a kettle to boil, scooped coffee like soil from a tin, and measured the sort of mercy beans can offer. I found a flour sack and poured until it had dignity, then added salt, a twist of lard, and a chunk of bacon rind wrapped in paper. I filled a second canteen and hunted for something sweet, the last spoon of blackberry jam that had pretended not to exist under a dish towel since spring. He watched without asking. Hunger learns how to be polite from shame. I pushed the coffee to him, cut with milk and a finger of sugar. He blinked at the heat, then smiled with his eyes. A small sunrise. When your whole body is a prayer, a cup can be a cathedral. When he'd eaten what pride allowed, he spoke. The English was careful and rough. Men come tomorrow, he said, hand slicing the air like a ridgeline. Many, for cows, for water, hungry horses, hungry grandmothers. He pinched his own arm, then held his palm out. No fight, if food. You could have heard the house settle around us, wood ticking like a pocket watch. I set my hands on the table, palm down, the way you do before you sign something you can't unsign. Where? I asked. He pointed northeast, toward the notch in the basalt that the maps call Cedar Gate and the people call something that means throat of the wind. Then he pointed to me. You, bread, talk, dawn. Are not an invitation so much as a proposal with the hinges of a truce. Dawn gives men ideas about themselves. It's easy to believe we're better at dawn. I nodded slowly. All right, I said. But we do it right. No rifles on either side. I'll bring bread. Your people bring their oldest and their youngest. That way, cowards don't make brave mistakes. He lifted his hand again and made that river motion, then tapped his chest. Agreed. I wrote on a scrap, teared clean from the coal ledger, Cedar Gate, dawn. Bread and water, no gunfire, men talk, women listen, children watch. We end something that should have ended before we were born. I signed it with my name and the brand, then stopped, thought. and drew a crooked bread loaf where a seal might go. A foolishness, maybe, but sometimes the mind understands what the heart won't accept until the hand draws it. When I slung the flour sack over his shoulder and tied the canteen strap across his chest, he stood taller, not from strength but purpose. He touched the blue calico at his neck, a reminder or a vow, and then, surprising me, put his palm on my shoulder, pressing once the way a father steadies a son about to step onto a dancing log. We left Lark in the corral and took the ground trail behind the tool shed, where an old cedar listens better. The moon had come up fat and bored, the kind you could bite if you didn't mind swallowing dust. We moved fast, then slow, then fast again, like men crossing a room where the furniture doesn't belong to them. At the first rise beyond my farthest gate, he paused. Two figures waited ahead, women by their carriage, one older, hair in two grey braids like twin storms, the other young with a scar pulling at her brow as if her face had been thinking too hard long ago. They didn't touch their knives, though I saw the hilts glint. My companion gave a call, a soft coyote yip that wasn't coyote at all, and their shoulders came down one notch. Words were exchanged I couldn't take apart. The older woman watched me as if I were a recipe she was considering trying. She stepped forward at last, laid two fingers to her throat, and then toward me, a greeting like wearing your name outside your skin. I did the same, clumsy but honest. "Elias," I said. "Bread." Her mouth twitched at the corner. She answered with a name I couldn't shape, and then added, for my benefit, "Dawn." She took the sack from the boy, weighed it, and nodded once without thanks, which is a kind of thank you that doesn't cost the giver dignity. The younger woman took the canteen and tipped it to her lips without drinking, wetting them only and passing it back, a lesson about enough. We parted with the sort of quiet that smooths itself out as it goes. I turned back toward the house alone, feeling like a man who's found a stray prayer and tucked it in his vest. Lark nickered when she saw me. I patted her. "Dawn it is," I told her, "and bread for an army." I didn't sleep. I set the sourdough to rise, fed the starter like it was a trusting thing that needed me, and lit the stove before midnight. I kneaded until my hands ached. I baked until the room smelled like forgiveness. While the loaves cooled, I found something at the back of the cupboard, a medicine pouch, leather darkened by time, that I'd taken off a dead man's wrist years ago when I was young and stupid, and believed that keeping something meant it wouldn't follow you. It had been sitting there like a storm cloud folded small. I held it, heavy as a truth. Tomorrow felt like a place you can only get to by leaving something where it belongs. When a man is alone with bread cooling and his past unpacked on the table, morning takes too long and no time at all. The sky at last paled where the world thins, and the wind came low, carrying the smell of horses that didn't belong to me. I saddled Lark. I left my rifle on the pegs by the door. I tied a strip of white flour sack around my arm, where any fool with a scope or a grudge could see it. Then I loaded the panniers with loaves and hung the medicine pouch around my neck, so that when I breathed, leather met skin, and both understood this was their last hour together. We rode to Cedar Gate at a trot that said we were late for our own story. The basalt rose like two black teeth. The mouth between them was where men had waited to ambush cattle and shoot shadows for many years. It is a place that remembers who men are when they think no one is watching. Dawn was stringing light over the far mesa, a silver rope pulling the day in. I reined in, the bread warm against my calves, and listened. I didn't hear guns. I heard hooves, and voices with the dust rubbed off them by night rides and old grief. I sat straight. It matters how you sit when the past comes up the road. The boy appeared first, with the blue scrap at his throat and a new steadiness in his shoulders. Behind him, 3 elders on ponies that looked like they remembered children's names. Behind them, women leading pack animals, and a handful of men my age with faces that had weathered for reasons other than sun. On the rim above us, 2 watchers sat their horses like punctuation. They would decide whether my bread was a period or a comma. "Elias," the boy called softly. "We bring hunger. You bring bread." "And water," I said, pointing to the dry throat of the gate. "And maybe an ending." We met in the middle, where the wind pauses to listen. I dismounted and stood, palms open, my throat suddenly tight, as if someone had reached in and cinched a strap there. The oldest of the elders edged his horse forward. He had a face arranged by weather into kindness, the kind that knows it can hurt and chooses not to. 50 winters, he said carefully, counting with a hand the old men use when they're talking about graves. 50 winters since the first wire cut our trail. 50 winters since the first cow was found with a cut brand, and the first boy fell for it. We have taken, you have taken. We have buried, you have buried. Enough. I lifted the pannier lid. Steam rose. You cannot buy that smell. You can offer it. Bread does not choose sides until the hands that pass it do. I held a loaf out to him with both hands. "For your oldest," I said, "and for your youngest." I looked at the boy, who watched like he knew the world was looking through him and into us. The elder took the bread and broke it into 3 pieces, not 2, passed one to the woman beside him, one to the boy, and kept one for himself. Then he looked at the pouch at my neck, and his eyes changed the way a river changes when it finds its old bed. I lifted it, hands shaking. "This," I said, "is not mine. I took it when I was younger and more foolish. I kept it because I didn't want to carry the man I took it from. I've carried him anyway. Maybe this should go home." He held out his hand, and when our fingers touched the leather together, the past made a sound only we heard. He nodded. No curse, no blessing, just an accounting set straight by a line drawn under the last entry. "Now," I said, my voice lower, "we talk. About water and wire. About drift gates we'll leave open when the river is down. About hiring your young men for day wages when the branding smoke rises. About you burning the grass the way your grandfathers did so it grows back thick instead of angry. About no more night rides and no more boys dying for cows that can't spell their own names." The elders listened without interrupting. The boy ate his bread slow, eyes moving from face to face the way a witness memorizes a jury. The women murmured among themselves and made a ring with the pack animals, a fence made of patience. One of the men on the rim above whistled a little query down. The elder didn't look up. He just raised 2 fingers and then flattened his hand, a sign, a language I loved by daylight and feared by firelight. "Yes," the hand said. "Now. We will bring our chief of water," the elder said. "You will bring your keeper of gates. We will make marks, not on skin," he added, glancing at my brand, a half-joke with old teeth, "but on wood that can be set above a door where children read it every morning." "I'll bring my foreman," I said, "and the sheriff if he can remember how to sit through a meeting without playing outlaw. And the preacher, not for praying but for writing. He's got a hand like fence wire, ugly but it holds." 3 days, the elder said. "At the barn where you keep your iron, we will come with empty hands." "I will set a long table," I said, my chest easing, "and more bread." The boy grinned then, the complicated knot of his face loosening. He tore a bite, turned, and handed it to me. I took it, aware of witnesses up on the rim and in the ground under our boots. You can taste salt and smoke in bread when it's the first honest thing in a decade. The horses shifted. The watchers exhaled. The wind broke and ran through the gate, clean as a new promise. 50 winters, the elder said again, and a morning. "A morning," I answered. We stood there a time with nothing to say that was better than the silence we'd made. Then I swung up on Lark, and the boy stepped to his pony, and we didn't turn our backs on each other as we rode away. We rode side by side until the trail split. He raised 2 fingers, I raised 2. We both lowered our hands slow, like lowering a flag you intend to fly again tomorrow. When I got back, the stove was still warm. I set the last loaves on the sill. I laid the carbine across the pegs and left it there. Then I pulled a piece of cedar from the woodpile, squared it up, and sanded it until it would take a mark. On it, I wrote in block letters you could read from horseback, "Water is to share." Gates are to open when the river is hungry. Children eat first. Under that I burned a crooked H, and beside it a symbol the boy had drawn with his finger in spilled flour before he left, a river line bending around a circle of dots. I didn't know the word for it, but I knew what it meant. Dawn had kept its appointment. Now noon would test it, and night would ask its questions. I poured coffee, tore the last heel that hadn't gone to the boy, and chewed it slow, as if the valley could learn patience from the way a man eats his own bread. It would take more than a loaf to end a half-century's meanness, but wars don't end with flags. They end with habits. One man refusing to reach for the rifle where his hand always went, one woman setting an extra plate, one boy carrying home a sack of flour and a phrase he can teach his grandmother. Tomorrow we'd sit at my barn under a sign that told the truth. The day after, we'd prove it or we wouldn't. Bread would get baked either way. And I, a man named after a deer with a brand no smarter than a scar, would keep my arm wrapped with a strip of flour sack until nobody needed to see it to believe. I wiped the crumbs from the table into my palm and stepped outside. Wind carried the smell of horses that weren't mine, headed home full in a way they hadn't started. I didn't smile. I did something quieter. I breathed, in, out, the way men breathe when they've been keeping air from themselves as penance. The valley breathed with me. And somewhere in that breath was a boy whose hands had warmed mine like a fire. 3 days later, the sun rose and found my yard busy with men who'd never shared a fence post. It smelled of yeast and saddle soap and wet rope. I had been up the whole night, mixing, kneading, baking, my own kind of lonesome liturgy. Bread cooled on every flat surface. The long table ran the length of the open barn door like a road. I'd planned it from pignon planks years back when I thought I'd need a place to fix harness and lay out maps. That morning it looked like a treaty, waiting to be written without ink. I'd hung the cedar board I carved above the door, not fancy. The letters were blackened with stove soot to make them shout. My hands smelled of flour, coffee and cedar, a better perfume than I deserved. By mid-morning they came. First the elders on their small, tough horses, moving like they'd already been traveling when the world was still choosing its shape. Then women carrying baskets and water skins. Then men with the distance of old campaigns in their eyes. And last, a herd of children who ran in spilling, then slowed and stood in a line because some lines are taught by grandmothers who don't say please more than once. From the ranch came my foreman, Gideon, who had a face like sandstone. Sun cracked him but couldn't break him, 2 hands as wide as shovels, and a gentleness around cattle that embarrassed other men into trying. From town came the sheriff, who had promised to be a listener and not a badge. He left his deputies behind. The preacher came with a ledger and a bottle of ink, not to bless, but to witness. And 3 of my neighboring ranchers rode in with a kind of curiosity that can turn into friendship or trouble, depending on how you portion it. No one wore their prettiest shirt. We wore our work. I walked out from the table with a loaf in each hand. That's as close as a cowboy gets to a flag. The boy, Toby, was there, his blue scrap washed and tied neat, as if someone had gotten up in darkness to boil water and rub sorrow out of cotton. He had his chin up not in defiance but in usefulness. Here I am, use me to see clearly. Welcome, I said, speaking to the oldest and the youngest first, because that's how you stack lumber that won't warp. You know why you're here because you chose to come. The board above the door tells what I brought. I'm asking you to bring the same. An elder whose hair fell like frost under a hat, made of something older than this county, nodded at the sign. He tapped each line with a fingertip like a teacher. Water is to share. Gates are to open when the river is hungry. Children eat first. Then he lifted his hand and added, first with his fingers, then in English, pressing through his teeth like a sprout through hard ground. And memory. We put memory here too. Amen, the preacher said before he could swallow it back, then looked embarrassed. Even so, he uncorked the ink and wet the nib of his pen, ready to carve words into paper thick as a saddle skirt. We began with water. That's always the true beginning. The chief of water among their people was a woman with a jaw like a plough blade, and eyes that had learned the color of drought. She unrolled a piece of deer hide, painted with a map nobody had put down in a courthouse. Seeps, springs, gullies that only run 4 days after a good snow, and the old dugouts where the ground remembers men with shovels who thought they could instruct it. She tapped each with a stick like a conductor finding his orchestra. I set down my confusion, our government section maps, the blue lines that are lies 3 years out of 5, and we made a new map together. Gideon spoke little, but when he did, it was to point out where the banks fail or the cattle crowd are narrow. We agreed that when the spring goes low, the north drift gate nearest Cedar Gate stays open. We agreed to move 2 troughs 50 yards to the east to keep Hoof from turning the fragile bank to soup. We agreed that when the snowmelt comes quick, we send the boys, ours and theirs, to cut a channel here and shore it there so the low wash doesn't take the fence line into Texas. We put marks on paper for each of those. An X that was actually an O pretending to be an X, a triangle where water pools, and a line with 3 teeth where the bank bites. The preacher wrote in letters, the water chief drew in marks, and truth sat between them like an usher. Next came grass. I told them what any honest cowman would, that our way, hold the graze too long, pray for rain, then fence the prayer, had scabbed the earth. Their old way, burning the grass clean on a windless day once the milk runs out of the stalk, needed trust from men who'd been taught to fear any fire. The elder with the frost hair said one sentence that took all the flourish out of the talk. Black in spring, green in summer. We agreed to pick 2 days, one in March, one in September, when we'd bring water and wet sacks and burn a finger-width's worth of pasture a mile wide. The sheriff, who'd stepped in 3 brush fires in his life, whistled low but agreed. "I'll bring the pumper," he said. "You bring the wind. Then work." I told them outright I'd been a fool to hire boys from downriver who didn't mind leaving gates swinging and talking to cattle as if they were logs. I offered what is due any neighbor, day wages in cash or beef, man's choice, for branding, fencing, fixing the mill when its heart sulks. A young man stepped forward, eyes like flint that someone had warmed in the coals, and said in his language a thing the boy translated, "Your dollars don't buy our men. They buy time. Time buys fathers. That is the math we respect." I reached out and shook his hand once, as plain as you thank a man for showing you your hat on your own head. Then came what no one says first, the dead. We made a list. It could have been a book, but we kept it to the ones whose names still made an ache behind the breastbone when spoken. I went first because it's law. The host has to put his throat under the knife or nobody will. I said the name of a boy of mine, Luke, who took a bullet-riding night guard 15 years ago and bled like a stopped clock under a bowl of stars. The elder said a name I couldn't shape, who had fallen near Yellowhorn Spring when cattle stampeded in a thunderstorm and men swore the lightning had chosen sides. The sheriff said a deputy's name. The water chief said the name of a grandmother who had walked 14 miles in heat to bring a yearling home and didn't. We placed each name like stones along a creek to walk across without wetting your boots. Then we did the thing that keeps names from rotting into excuses. We agreed that the children, all those lined up like fence posts, would hear those names once a year, then hear bread break. The old man told the boy to translate. The boy did, voice steady. We remember not to keep fighting. We remember to stop. Only after all that did we eat. Children first, we said, and the line bent into a smile nobody drew, just happened from custom. I cut the loaves and put them into small hands, watching each go where it needed to. Bread makes men equal for exactly as long as it takes to chew. It's a useful span. While the children ate, the preacher wrote clean versions of our marks. He left room at the bottom for signs that would mean something in a court that doesn't smell like horses, but he also brought out a plank, a spare end tabletop, and an iron brand I'd heated to a glow not far from orange. Gideon and I pressed the crooked H into the wood. The elders asked for a stick of willow. The water chief cut a willow branch and seared its end in the coals, then burned a river mark beside my H. the same bending line the boy had drawn in flour. Last, the boy took the end and dotted a small circle of 7 burns near the river line. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. The children, their number today, would be part of the mark now. We set that branded wood under the cedar sign at the barn's mouth. The sheriff tied a length of his Tin Star's leather thong to the nail that held it in place, a humble thing for a man with a badge. He said, "This here's not law, it's better, custom with witnesses." Then, because the valley favors symmetry, the old men asked me if I had anything else that wanted going home. They didn't say it sharp. They said it like a neighbor noting a hinge squeaking. I surprised myself by nodding. I reached into my vest and drew out a small silver concho I'd used too long on my spur, one I'd traded for years ago with a man who didn't have the right to trade it. I laid it on the plank beside the brands. The eldest elder peered at it, his eye going far then near. He touched the center where a hammered sun waited. He smiled, not the big smile folks use when they're about to pocket something, but the kind that says, "Ledger balanced." He lifted the concho and turned to the youngest of the girls standing by, a skinny thing with braids that kept trying to fly away. He placed it in her palm and closed her fingers around it. "Keep for memory," he said in his language, and then to me in mine. "We carry forward what once was carried away." You could feel it, the valley settling an inch on its foundations. Some wars end like a door slamming. This one ended like a house easing in the cool after sundown. We weren't done. Ending isn't a thing you do once. It's a habit. We made more marks. Driftgate duty on odd months would be ours. Even months would be theirs. Spring burn day would be declared by the water chief and confirmed by Gideon, and the sheriff would sign off like a midwife. Pay would be recorded in the preacher's ledger and in the deerhide map's corner with a small 4-square symbol meaning beef, or a 2-line mark meaning dollars. We wrote a rule that a horse taken for honest need, storm, injury, rattler, would be returned at the first safe chance with a strand of blue cloth tied to its left rein, so there'd be a sign in the night you could trust. The boy grinned when he heard blue. He touched his own calico scrap and looked toward the water chief, who pretended not to be fond. When the table had been laid bare of bread and covered with names and marks, I brewed coffee black enough to show a man himself if he looked in the cup. I poured for the elders, then for Gideon, the sheriff, the preacher, the water chief, the young men, the women who'd carried more than baskets today, and the boy who earned a grown man's mug by how he'd stood. We raised the cups, not high, just a hand's width. You don't toast with shouting where people have been buried without sermons. "Enough," the elder said again, and we all said it back. Enough. Not like surrender, but like permission to stop pushing a heavy door that's already open. They left in small groups, the way clouds break from a storm. The children ran a little, then remembered, then walked. The boy lingered. He reached up as if to touch the cedar sign, then pulled his hand back, not shy, respectful. He looked at me. "Work tomorrow," he said. "Work tomorrow," I answered. "We'll start with moving that trough east, like your water chief told me, and every man brings his own canteen. I'm out of jam." He laughed. He didn't run. He got on his pony and rode with the gravity you learn when you've held a treaty plank steady while men mark it. In the weeks that followed, we lived our paper. The north drift gate swung open when the spring thinned. I watched 2 of their boys, the flint-eyed young man and another with the patience of a fence post, wade in knee-deep and pull a mat of sticks clear so the water could talk again. Gideon taught them the whir and clank of the windmill's head, and they taught him where not to set his feet after a rain, because the clay will hug you to death. We burned grass along the low ridge, under a sky so still that smoke went up like it had instructions to report to heaven. And then the green came early, and in sheets, soft as new promises. The sheriff came out 2 evenings with a star tucked dumbly into his vest and watched the gates and scratched his name beside ours where the preacher kept track. The preacher's wife sent a pan of cinnamon buns the second week. I told her she'd ruined us because the mouth forgets almost every sermon except the ones with sugar attached. There were missteps. A heifer carved in the wrong drawer, and men shouted who shouldn't. A dog chased a sheep that didn't belong to him. A boy from town slurred a word he'd learned from men who liked the sound of their own ignorance, and the water chief's eyes went winter, and every man there wanted to be summer fast. We corrected it on the spot, the way you fix a gate that sags, no waiting for it to fall. We learned the difference between apology and excuse. One repairs, the other is rust. At the end of a month, a dust storm came from the south, chewing fence and dignity. When it cleared, half the valley looked like a table someone had cleared with an angry arm. Our new trough lay where the old creek bed remembered being young, and the cedar sign had taken a bite out of the barn's eave. I climbed up to set it true again. The boy was there with a hammer I'd given him the second week, handle sanded to fit his hand, and together we seated the nail. He stepped back, head cocked, and read the words aloud in his careful English. Water is to share. Gates are to open when the river is hungry. Children eat first. Then he pointed to the bran board under it, the crooked H and the river line with 7 dots, and added, softer in his language, something like, memory stays and eats with us. That night, after work and before sleep, I sat on the porch with a slice of bread too hard to be called anything but honest. The valley had a different quiet. Not the quiet you get after a gunshot, where your ears ring with what might come next. The quiet of animals fed and fences holding, and men who can put their hats on chairs without worrying about where they'll land. I kept thinking how small the first act had been, a heel of bread, and how large its shadow ran across the ground. We make wars big because we're ashamed of how they begin, with a sly taking, a proud refusal, a hot word. Peace is small to start because it has to fit through all the places those big things have broken. Years later, because years did pass, and the cedar board weathered until the letters looked carved by the wind, and the boy got taller, and his scrap of blue calico turned into a man's bandana, and the elders let their grandsons sit nearer the center of talk, and Gideon taught a young woman from the canyon how to hear a heifer's sigh and know when to help. Somebody asked me what we did to end a 50-year war. I said we didn't end it. We ran out of patience with it. Then we fed what came after. I told them if they needed a sermon, ask the preacher. If they needed a law, ask the sheriff. If they needed to remember, ask the water chief about the willow brand. And if they needed a recipe, ask any child who had been in my barn that day. And if they needed a thing to do right then, I said, bake a loaf, set an extra plate, move a trough east, tie a blue strip on the left rein when you borrow a horse, read the sign above your door out loud, and chew slow enough to hear the valley breathe. The boy, no longer a boy, rode by that evening and lifted 2 fingers. I lifted mine. He had a child at his front pommel, a little one whose eyes looked like dawn coming through weather. He pointed to the cedar sign and said something to the little one, who nodded and said the last line clear enough to write, "Children eat first." We didn't make peace. We practiced it. And every morning, when I tore the first heel from a new loaf and set it on the sill to cool, I remembered that a 50-year war had stopped, not because men got smarter all at once, but because one hungry child held bread like a sunrise, and men older than the wrongs they carried decided to watch that light instead of their own shadows.